Hey, hi everybody. I'm Virginia Amos. I am a realtor with Coldwell Banker in Old Town Alexandria, and today is the 19th edition of From Our House to Yours, where we are talking with people, with businesses, and with organizations that make Alexandria such a great place to live and work. And today I am delighted to have with us, his name is actually not Lost Boys Cider, it is Tristan Wright, but he is the founder and creator of Lost Boys Cider. He is a Delray resident, I'm happy to say, and he has a really interesting journey. So Tristan, why don't we just kind of plunge right into how you got into the world of apple cider?
Well, yeah, gosh, I'll make it as short as possible.
Oh, that's okay.
I've had some practice at this, but yeah, so 6 years ago, I got a headache, and the headache didn't go away, and it was followed by some joint pain and muscle pain, and I started having some problems with my vision. Went to the doctor, and 9 months later, after about a million tests, I was diagnosed with celiac. And have so I have a gluten allergy and a soy allergy, and that led me away from beer and whiskey were my two primary go-tos, and ultimately wound up drinking wine. And as that season came to an end, we were moving into spring and summer, and I was looking for something a little more refreshing that was carbonated, that wasn't beer or gluten-free beer. And I stumbled across Potter's Cider out of Charlottesville, Virginia, and they do a wonderful job. And it literally was like a light bulb went off in my head. I said, wow, this is fantastic. Why don't we have a cidery in Northern Virginia? And so did a little research and came to find out that it would be possible with some work to get something done. And went out to Oregon State and enrolled in cider production school. And then I went up to Cornell and started working on a viticulture degree in yeast and wine studies. And I gave up my banking career, which I had invested my adult life in for 17 years, and made an about face and went into being an entrepreneur.
Good. I am always amazed at the things that you can get a degree in. And cider making has to be one of them.
Yeah. Well, so these extended studies programs are basically adult. Well, they're for anyone really, but for me anyway, I was an adult when all this took place and occurred. But the cider production school was great because it opened up doorways to other cidery owners and winemakers that I would in a million years never have gotten to cross paths with in my prior life. And out in Oregon, there's a concentration of just some of the best cideries in the world, and they're tripping over apples. So there's a plethora of different styles and different makers and techniques. And so Oregon State's got a wonderful ag program, and they had been ahead of the curve here on this from the beginning, since cider's rebound about 10 years ago. And so the East Coast was catching up, but cider's very alive and well in places like Michigan and Pennsylvania and New York. And it's very, very strong in Southern Virginia. And Charlottesville's had a lot of success with wineries making cider. Cider is wine, but now we've got some wonderful cideries that have been making cider for, I think, 10 or 11 years. Albemarle Cider Works has been making great cider for, I think, a decade now.
And isn't cider actually quite an old drink?
Yes. So there was for about 200 years, there were stories of when the Mayflower left England a day out to sea, its mizzen boom was broken in a storm, and they used a printing press screw, two printing press screws, to repair that. And historians had always sort of debated as to why a printing press on such a small ship with limited capacity would have been brought. And the ship's log didn't clearly decipher what that was, what the screws were attached to. Well, they weren't printing presses after all the research had concluded. They were apple presses. And so as far back as the first days of European America, we've had apples. They brought seeds with them and cultivated apple trees. And interestingly, every tree, with the exception of 2 types of crab apples, one out of Canada and one here in the United States, every tree that you've ever laid eyes on was cultivated by hand. It was planted and then it was cultivated. Yeah, and so apple trees are not native to North America. They're from a small valley. They've been tracked back to one valley in Kazakhstan, modern day Kazakhstan.
Goodness.
And the apple trade was part of, I think the oldest journal entry in history related to apples anyway, is from Julius Caesar's journal, 22 BC, I believe. And he's talking about the apples that they were growing in what's now modern day Somerset in England, where they're still making wonderful apple cider. And Julius Caesar fell in love with cider and brought cider back to Italy and is credited with Italy's apple cider scene. Yeah, and what's really cool about cider, though, is Prohibition wiped out cider. It wiped out cider for modern history, really, and the record books. Unless you spend some time understanding how important cider was before we had a sustainable crop system, and then trusting water sources. Cider is what frontiers people and cities survived on. In fact, I think the average child drank about 70 gallons of cider, alcoholic cider. They estimate it was about 2.5% every year.
Interesting.
And some people have suggested that's why when you look at some of the paintings of Thomas Jefferson and Washington and all these folks in the kind of revolutionary period and before, their cheeks are always rosy and red and they're a little plump. It's from all that sugar in the unfermented cider that they were drinking.
Right. Well, I mean, it makes perfect sense because particularly in Europe, people didn't drink water. I mean, even in the lowest, you are a beggar, you drank wine because it was actually easier to get and it was safer than the water.
Yeah, and it's interesting what could have happened, but with the demise of, so in New York, for instance, the movement there, they required orchard owners to pull the trees out, cut them down, or they burned them. And I think they burned nearly every single cultivated orchard in New York and Pennsylvania and moving into Ohio. And, you had people like Johnny Appleseed, who is credited with being, like the father of the apple movement. Johnny Appleseed was actually an evangelist, and he was spreading the word, the gospel. But in doing so, he was planting apple trees in addition to that to get the message.
This was during Prohibition. They made them burn the trees.
Yeah, this would have been the decade leading up to that. And then the decade after that. Yeah, and you think about that, there were something like, at the time, 3,000 different varietals of apples that had been created. And so they're finding them. There are groups out there that are finding new apple trees literally almost every week right now. And these apple trees, so we're in the Piedmont growing region here in Virginia. This is the 8th growing region as it's recognized agriculturally in the country. And our trees grow on hillsides because they need cool airflow to protect the leaves from disease. The worst disease on a tree is called fire blight that attacks the root systems. And it's an infection that occurs that can wipe out in a season an entire orchard. And so different trees will grow in different areas, but we're not too indifferent from parts of California and the Pacific Northwest. And so Virginia itself, Washington obviously is known for planting trees. And Jefferson, with his connection to wine, the ambassador of France, and he's credited with putting Chateau Lafite in plain view for us, and they're still finding some bottles that he may have actually purchased in cellars that were boarded up during the Nazi era, and they're finding Thomas Jefferson ordered, allegedly, Chateau Lafite bottles, which is pretty exciting, but they were left behind during the French Revolution. But, so Thomas Jefferson had that connection, and he planted a tremendous amount of apple trees down there. And so Virginia's got really some of the, outside of Massachusetts in the early 1600s, where the apple trees were first planted by a priest there. We've got some of the oldest, most sustainable trees in the country. And I guess the message there is that Virginia, I'm on the Virginia Cider Makers Association board, and we're working really hard to try to bring Virginia's cider making history forefront. And, part of our responsibility at Lost Boy has been, we're a modern progressive cidery. So we aren't purists in the sense that we just use apples only, like some cideries. Ancho in DC is an apples only cidery. Chuck and the Sheltons down at Albemarle, apples only. We like to use a lot of adjuncts. So we pair up our ciders and co-ferment them with raspberries or hops or pineapples, fresh cold-pressed ingredients that are pureed on site and then truly co-fermented with a Sauvignon Blanc yeast. So you get that nice, bright, kind of very light and subtle after flavor, but we try to make the apple still the forefront of the experience on your palate. And so we've got a tremendous responsibility, given Virginia's history and the history of cider in general, just to respect that and not abuse the privilege, because it's really easy to make bad cider. It's really easy to make cider sweet. So principally, one of our foundational principles is that we make dry cider. So we remove all the sugar during the fermentation process, which really reduces a lot of the side effects, the health effects that people have sort of come to associate cider with some of the larger producers. I always refer to those large companies as kind of gateway cider producers. Baseball stadium cider, or grocery market cider. We'd like to think that while we are progressive and we are a modern cidery, we still spent a tremendous amount of time researching and respecting the history of the making process and doing things the right way.
Now, do you have your own orchard?
We do. We've got control of about 687 acres of land outside of Winchester that head down Route 81 through the Shenandoah, towards Virginia. The Glaze family is our orcharding partner. So we lease the land from the Glazes, who have owned that for 5 generations.
Wow.
And purchased some of their trees from Thomas Jefferson's orchard manager.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So do you make your cider on site?
We do. Well, there's a couple of steps in the process. So David Glaze is responsible for cultivating and growing the trees and caretaking for them during this season, and then picking the apples themselves. And then they have a picking operation. And then we have a pressing barn in Winchester, Virginia, which the Glaze brothers, the Glaze family, control. And we select the apples. So we've got our varietals. We have a 5 apple varietal base cider that we use, and that's Comeback Kid, as you'd see it on the shelves. And then from there, we usually pull some of the base cider off, and then we begin the process of sort of scientifically changing the properties of the cider and adding things and removing things and whatnot, and creating other ciders. And so David and Philip will press the apples in Winchester, and then we ship them to Old Town, Alexandria, where we begin the fermentation process. And we do that in stainless steel tanks or IBCs, international bulk containers, or we do them in French oak wine barrels or other barrels that we've sourced around the world.
Well, the apples are seasonal. So what do you do? I mean, once you make the cider, does it have a shelf life?
Yeah, so that's one of the balancing acts that we're working through now. We source 100% of our apples and our juice from the Shenandoah, so we're a Virginia-based cidery. It's a wonderful point in question that you ask. So when the apples are picked, different varieties of apples can be picked as late as January and February.
Oh, okay.
Or as early as coming right up. Different types of apples will want to hang longer on the limb. So once they're picked, we put them in a couple of different environments, but those are all static environments where the oxygen is removed. And oftentimes nitrogen is replacing the oxygen and pumped in, and those apples then remain static.
Okay.
Not indefinitely, but we can get through harvest season in about 6 to 7 additional months without really having a problem on the pressing side. So the apples survive on their own starches and sugars and do begin to break down. And starting in a couple of weeks, we'll have to stop pressing. So we've got 6,000 gallons of fermentation tank space on standby.
Mm-hmm.
And so the glaze boys will hold out for as long as they can. And we're constantly testing the apples to see what the residual sugars look like. And that's important because the byproduct of pressing the apples and then adding the yeast, and then the yeast chomps away on the sugars and creates a convection process. And the byproduct of the yeasts consuming the sugars is methane, CO2 that comes out of the top of the tanks, and then methane falls back down in the form of alcohol, just like they make moonshine back in the woods. And so if the apples don't have any retained sugar and they're spent, your cider, one, will taste like old kind of musty water, but two, it won't be alcoholic. And so we measure the Brix level of the cider as it comes in, as it pressed, and throughout the season, the Brix level will continue to fall. Brix is the measurement of sugar that's in whatever liquid it is that you're measuring. And so our Brix level is usually around 13.5, 12.5%. And so as the apples age, that Brix level begins to come down. There becomes a point where you can no longer make quality cider. It turns real quickly into basement cider.
So the cider is alcoholic, but it has no sugar.
Right. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. That's always interesting for people. Same thing as grape wine. We're able to determine what all of our ciders need to remain below 7%. There's tax reasons for that, and was mainly tax reasons for that. And also we're making on the edge of what we refer to in beer and cider as session ciders, where you and I could comfortably have 2 or 3 of those and possibly still drive a vehicle or ride a bicycle or not get ourselves into a situation. And so, most session ciders or beers are kind of 4.5 to 7 is on the high side. So all of our ciders are 6.9%. We determine that by the amount of sugar in the cider that we press out in Winchester and deliver here to Old Town before we ferment. So we already know what the ABV of the cider will be, just like wine.
All right.
So yeah, so the more starch, the more sugar, and the more acid in the apples, the better the cider is going to be.
So tell us a little bit about the cidery, where it is, and is it because I haven't been there. I must admit, well, you've been closed and you're going to open this weekend, right?
Yeah, we're opening the patio on Friday. Good. We've taken our time and some extraordinary measures to ensure that we've done things the right way, and we were prepared to invite guests back and maintain a level of safety that I was comfortable with. I watched closely what happened in Delray with our fellow restaurateurs and a lot of the cideries around the country that have opened, and so we've taken a lot of note from those folks and some of the successes and some of the not so successes. And so we felt like it's ready to at least test that out. We have room for 35 people. We're opening on a reservation only basis.
Okay.
It's just 8 tables. It should be fairly low key. We're asking that everyone is 21 and older. And there's some other rules that we posted online. But yeah, so we're located off of Eisenhower Avenue in what's called the West End. Mm-hmm. We're officially in Old Town Alexandria. We have an Old Town zip code, but if you head over to that Whole Foods off of Duke Street and you go around that weird circle, then there's some undeveloped fields over there. We are right across the street, the parking lot from the jail, which I didn't realize existed until, but I've had some people visit the cidery, oddly enough, and I said, hey, how'd you find us early on? They're like, oh, I know where the jail is.
You didn't ask anymore.
Right. I don't need any more information than that. But yeah. So, yep, we're over by the jail.
Okay. Now, when people come, is it like going to a bar, but they're ordering cider, and do you serve food?
Yeah, there's a big story to all this, but there are a lot of interesting laws, some of which are very antiquated, around operating a tasting room in the state of Virginia as a winery.
Okay.
One of those requirements, and this was something that Bill Butcher had to deal with personally when he was attempting to open a tasting room at Port City. He had to go down and change the legislature to recognize that a tasting room was legal if done following a certain grouping of criteria that didn't exist. There was no law for that. So what we've done is we've leased the land, which qualifies us as an agricultural entity, and then we've planted an orchard down on our site of 8 apple trees, which we manage and are cultivating ourselves and growing apples, and then we'll press those apples on site and make cider from them. So we are what's called legally a farm winery. And so as a farm winery, which controls its own land, and 50% of our product, in our case 100%, but a minimum of 50% of our product comes from land that we own and control, allows us to have a tasting room. So when you arrive, it does feel like a bar. We've got tap handles, and there is a bar with bar stools, but we're not able to serve tables as a tasting room. We offer flights, which are 3-ounce little glasses on a flight board, and you can choose your ciders that you'd like to put into the flight itself. And then, of course, we have pints and tulip glasses as well, which you'd find in a regular bar environment.
So does this preclude children coming?
The reopening will. We're sticking to 21 and over, but the cidery, I think I mentioned to you offline, we have 3 small children that we're raising. And one of the things for us when we were designing the tasting room was the tagline down there as we train and onboard people is it's an open environment that's safe and welcoming for anyone. It's a judgment-free zone. So irregardless of, which is, kind of a hot topic right now, but your skin color, your personal preferences and race have nothing to do with us welcoming you into a tasting experience. Our mission is to spread the cider love, and we want to bring people together and enjoy a drink with an old friend or a family member, or
age-wise, I mean, children and young adults under 21 can come in?
Yes. Yeah, there are no restrictions on that prior to COVID. We've modified that, as we move back in because we're so limited on space and you can't really control kids and we never know if they've got COVID or what. So, yeah, no, it's a very friendly family environment and kid environment.
Well, that's good to know. I'm thinking about when our family comes from California and from South Carolina, I think it would be a really fun place to bring them, and something I know that they don't have access to, but I'm thinking about the grandkids. So, you mentioned something, and on Monday, I was talking to Bill Blackburn from Pork Barrel Barbecue and Chelsea Anderson, who's Mike Anderson's daughter and is heavily involved in the operations. And Chelsea's been keeping a diary, like a running narrative of what happened with the shutdown. And, I was saying to them, a year from now, when somebody starts taking hospitality classes at, one at like Columbia University or they're at Johnson and Wales, there's going to be a course on the pandemic. And it will be so valuable to have that information, because there was no playbook for how to do this.
Yeah, no, isn't that the truth? I was in business for a long time on the banking side, and I got to work with some really successful people monetarily, but also morally successful people that were driven in a manner with their feet on the ground that made them successful. And again, it wasn't always financially, but I adopted a lot of those principles that they had taught me over the years in my banking career. And one of them was to be adaptive.
Mm-hmm.
One of them was to welcome and invite new, fresh ideas and remove yourself from the constant pressure of the decision-making process as the owner. And so I relied heavily on my team members when we transitioned. And we had a lot of things thrown at us quickly, but I knew what we needed to accomplish and what we needed to do. And I looked back on that and I could feel it as it was occurring, but we were so nimble. We moved so quickly. We were the first cidery in the state to close, recognizing how we were seeing thousands of people a week. And it just was very obvious that that couldn't continue. And that was a painful decision, but necessary. But we started real quickly doing things with folks like Chelsea at Tequila and Tacos, partnering and trying to aid and assist some of our friends in the neighborhood by allowing them to serve food to our clients. So we started a farm share program with a local farm that sources all their food. And so we now have salad share. We bring in oysters on Thursday from Sapitas down on the Virginia coast, and their oysters are picked the day before and brought up fresh. And so, I think it's interesting that the folks that will come out of this had a network of people that they had been supporting or maintaining a relationship with prior to COVID. They were already good members of the community. They were self-aware. They felt responsible. You look at a cidery, or us, our business is, not to continue to highlight and pick on Tequila and Taco, but they make Mexican food, right? What is okay, I make cider, big deal. But the reality is that, we bring thousands of people together a month. Yeah. We provide them with an experience that exceeds cider or Mexican food. We bring you together with someone you may not have seen in 5 years. It may be an old college friend. It may be an old boyfriend. And that's very, very personal to people. Mm-hmm. We've had people get engaged in the tasting room. We had people across the street in the apartment building that came over and told me, this really choked me up. It was my first month, and a young couple, 23 years old from Florida, came over and they said, we want you to know that we were moving. And when we realized what you were doing, and then we came and visited this last month, we renewed our lease for another year because you're here.
Oh my gosh.
And that again was another light bulb for me that just spoke to that whole thesis around the community involvement and nearly the requirement that I have as an owner to make the mission broader than just slinging cider out there. So
I couldn't agree more. And I think for all of us, and certainly this is true in real estate, who had to make some major changes.
Yeah.
But rather than mumbling and grumbling, I admit I did a little of it. You make that pivot and you just open the doors to whatever is out there.
Yeah.
And it's amazing what comes back to you.
Yeah. And you talked about Mike Anderson and Bill, those guys have been around for a while, and there's a reason for that. It's not because they're nice guys. It's not because everyone likes them. I mean, they're just good people. They're good members of the community. So, we strive for that.
Well, it sounds like you were right there in the ranks of the good people. And if Virginia doesn't have a state fruit, I think that we should campaign to have the apple declared the state fruit.
Oh my gosh. What? I'm going to do a live Google search while we're here. What is Virginia's
state fruit?
Golly, I should know this, huh? Virginia's state fruit is the apple.
Yes.
There we go. I should have known that. How did I not know that?
A whole new line of advertising.
Man, Virginia, you taught me something new today. I should have just played that off and said, yeah, it's the apple.
Well,
Yeah.
I was going to think, that you could just start this whole campaign and we could go down to Richmond and hold up signs and
Yeah.
it'd be fun.
Fight for the apple.
That's right. That's right. Well, listen, I'm going to plan on coming over there this weekend. I've got an open house. I'm not sure it'll be this weekend, but I will be there soon.
You're always welcome.
And I will make sure that we see each other and that we get to say hello. And I wish you well. I'm excited about your business. I'm excited about your being part of the business community here in Alexandria. And it's absolutely, you are a great example of the people and the businesses that make this such a great city to live in.
Well, thank you. That's nice of you to say.
So thank you so much for being with us. And all you folks out there, make your reservations online to get to Lost Boys Cider this weekend. You will not be disappointed. And I will see you around the neighborhood.
Cheers.
Okay. Bye.
All right. Bye, Virginia.